Hi, I'm John Grooters. The historical stories of the Bible are either true or they're not. But who's checking? I mean, faith is faith, but it matters to many people if the word is reliable when it tells us something happened, like the Exodus, or the miraculous parting of the Red Sea. Documentary filmmaker Tim Mahoney doesn't shy away from the investigation, and he's our guest today on No Shame.
Have no shame. No, we are not afraid. No shame. On the gospel of his name. It's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid. No shame.
So Tim Mahoney is a documentary filmmaker. You've devoted basically the last 20 years of your life to digging into the stories from the book of Exodus in the Bible, and to see if there's archaeological evidence to corroborate the stories of Joseph and Moses, and now the parting of the Red Sea. Tim, it is great to have you back on the No Shame podcast. Thank you for coming.
Oh, I always enjoy being with you, John. And I feel like I am a big fan of the No Shame podcast. And so I think I've listened to every one.
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, you're a guest that's sort of right why we do this, and you started a film series called Patterns of Evidence, and I saw your first film, The Exodus. I saw it while I was driving in the car. Judy was driving, but we were coming down to Nashville, and I just got more excited every mile we drove as I was finally getting a chance to see that film and realize how significant I thought it was, and still think it was, The Exodus. But you called it Patterns of Evidence, and I was not 100% certain where that came from. But now that I've seen you've done film 1 and film 2 and now film 3 and about to release film 4, it's all kind of clarifying for me now. It's not just patterns of evidence within that first film, but you are building upon building upon building. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the whole thing is the word patterns were, that's a very unique word. In fact, you'll find in the Bible that the word pattern is used. Moses was instructed, I think, to build according to a pattern as well. And I started to understand that using a scientific method was actually a really good way at this time in our culture and in history to start to ask the questions about the Bible, the authenticity of the Bible. And what you could see, and like we said, after 20 years, I've been at this, I started to realize that there was a pattern and that many people were just ignoring it.
And if you see a pattern, that's different than seeing chaos, right? So even as we'll get into the subject of the Red Sea, but even as you're exploring the bottom of the Red Sea and looking at coral, or if people are walking through Israel looking at rock formations, if you just see random rock formations, right, then there's nothing really there. But if you all of a sudden see a bunch of rocks piled in a straight line, or if you see a coral reef that's in a perfect circle, that's a pattern that you should pay attention to in a sense, right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And the issue for the first films was that I don't know how it came along, but I think it's the way I think. I had spent quite a bit of time, doing marketing videos, and I understood that information was built around a framework, and creativity on one side is good. But creative ideas that don't have a framework, in other words, something that's like substantive that holds it together, you had to, if you're going to make a commercial, which I have made, I don't know how many. I just threw out an entire dumpster of masters. So I know I made a lot of commercials. Maybe over 1,000 to 2,000. I don't know how many. But we always had to work on the development of those. And you're always trying to understand if you're going to make a claim in a marketing standpoint, you have to back that claim up, and then you can create creativity around that claim. But is it the fastest? Is it the most efficient, product that you're working with? In the particular case of the biblical narrative and the biblical account, there was a claim that the Bible made, was that these people called the Israelites lived in Egypt, and that they were enslaved. But when they first came there, they came there under the invitation of Joseph and the Pharaoh. Joseph wanted his family to come. Pharaoh let him come, and they stayed in this particular area. Well, that pattern of evidence is what we looked for in the very first film. And what ended up happening was that we kept finding more and more patterns that were intriguing. And we said, well, what are we going to do with all this? And eventually I was able to see that I had such a large pattern system that was developing that it couldn't be contained in one film, and that the patterns would come back and overlap themselves in the future. And that's how we sort of came to the place where we said, I think the patterns of evidence approach is the right approach. But there's more than one film that's going to be about patterns. So what's the first one? And we said, let's focus on Exodus. And then we're going to do the route of the Exodus, which became the Red Sea miracle. And then, but in between that, all of a sudden this idea of language came up with the Moses controversy. The fact that the pattern started to reveal that the earliest form of the alphabet shows up at the very same location that the Israelites lived. I mean, this was remarkable. And I don't know if you ever had it, John, where you're working on something and then you realize, wait a minute, all this new information I wasn't expecting, it's kind of getting in the way of my plan. So you have to ask yourself, am I going to pursue this? And that's the part I've really appreciated about the people who I've been involved with, is that they've let me pursue the investigation. And then the Moses controversy was born. And what is that? Well, most people say, well, that Moses didn't write the first books of the Bible. And we say, well, why? And then I asked the question, well, if he did, what would he have needed? And he would have needed an alphabet. He would have needed a way to write it. And that's what we find in the Moses controversy, which was the second film, was that at this same location, the pattern started to build upon itself, was the origins of the world's first alphabet. People who were not Egyptian, that were Semitic, took Egyptian hieroglyphs, and here's like the bowl symbol. They took that aleph and they turned it, eventually became the letter A. And that then gave us, and I got goosebumps when I thought about this. I mean, I still do. I just got a tingle, talking about this, is that it's, what does it say in the Bible? It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In order for you to understand the Word of God, you have to understand how to understand the Word. Mm-hmm. And so the beauty of an alphabet was that you could not only create words, but you could read them, and common people could read them. And this alphabet became the basis of all alphabets to this day around the world. And no other book in the world has utilized the alphabet more than the Bible.
Well, Tim and I share some common history. I've filmed in a lot of these same places, same caves, used even some of the same actors, and had some of the same passions. And so the work that, if you're listening to this podcast, this is a treat for you, because you might not want to read all the academic back and forth. You might not want to go spend 11 years, studying seminary, but you still have a Bible like I do in your house. And you can read the Bible and ask yourself, is this reliable, or is this a fairy tale? And it is an important question, and it's not just an important academic question, but it will change everything about the way you live and the hope that you have, whether or not you decide that this is the Word, you were just talking about the Word of God, or if this is just another religion that has its faults. Because of that, I don't think this is just a religious discussion. I think this is so critical. There's a group that I came across years ago, I know you know them, called Answers in Genesis, and they really focused on the book of Genesis. And I've interviewed 50 scientists for films for them over the course, realizing that there are credentialed specialists in many fields of astrophysics and microbiology and time and space and light and carbon dating and all kinds of subject matters that can apply their learning to what the Bible says and find synthesis. People don't have the time to do all that research, but Answers in Genesis has been a very helpful resource. It seems like Tim Mahoney has taken the next book upon himself. You're like the Answers in Exodus guy. And what Tim does for all of us, if you haven't seen his films, and I would urge you to do so, is that he doesn't lecture us as an academic. Instead, he brings us along, or what you do, Tim, is you bring us along on your journey of discovery, and you travel all over the place and just probe and ask and push, and then you explain what you have found to all of us, and you give us a chance to analyze And so you showed us in your first movie, The Exodus, you found this amazing city underneath the city of Ramses, and where there had been no evidence of Hebrew people in Egypt, now, voila, indisputable evidence. I mean, that was an amazing building block upon which you can build the rest of your series, was it not, that from your first film?
It really was. And what happened in that building block was that I started to develop, marketing materials. And I actually made 2 films prior to the film that you see on The Exodus. And those films were the beginning of an understanding that there was a much, much larger thing going on here. And as a documentary filmmaker, I had made commitments, by the way, to investors to basically have a film, completed in about a year. And what ended up happening over the course of 20 years is that we came out with this enormous investigation that produced 4 feature films and 4 what we call, let's say, director cut box sets with about additional 32 hours of information. And lecture series. It grew into something much larger than I had anticipated. But that very first film had parts of it actually, if I like to see, it's like an arc. It had an arc of history, and I could see that the writings of Moses and the Exodus were a part of something that has extended all the way through till today. I mean, and it has to do also with the covenant that God made with the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. God told Moses to go bring the people out of Egypt and in what would become the Exodus and bring them to the mountain, and that he would make them a nation. And that goes back even earlier to the time of Abraham, when Abraham was given a promise that his people, that his descendants would grow into a mighty nation. And Abraham, as you know, didn't have an heir by his wife. And eventually Isaac came along. And so I started to go, well, how am I going to deal with all of this information? And then it took a while for me to understand the correct structure. But I knew that I had to do really good recreations, as good as I could possibly do, of the biblical narrative. And that's always been a challenge, because it's a documentary, it's not a feature film. And we use a combination of different kinds of techniques to do that. But I knew that many people today don't really know the Bible, the biblical account. They're unfamiliar with the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And I really call it the First Testament, not the Old Testament.
Right.
There's the Hebrew Bible. So I could see that when I first started making this film, and us, both you and I are as filmmakers, the first 2 films that I made were really almost like when you go to school and you're back in the day when they had a wood shop and you made your first bookcase, whatever, Well, the first one doesn't look too good, and the second one's a little bit better. But by the time you get to the third one, you think, well, maybe I know how to make a bookcase right now. And that was the way it was with me with these films. I started to understand more and more, and that second film had 3 parts to it. An early part, a middle part of history, and then modern day. And I felt like 3 different films. So we made a decision to take what was really 3 minutes of that film, and that turned into, I opened that investigation up, and that turned into a 2-hour feature film on the Exodus. And so I'm still in that first part. I just expanded it into now 8 hours of feature film. That's how much detail and information there is. And I think for people who are artists, like both of us, you start to realize that we want to be an overnight success, and some things just feel like failure. And for literally, I think it was 12 years, I kind of felt like a failure because it was such a long process of trying to unfold this investigation. But I have to tell you that if you stick with something, I look back on it now, and I'm glad that I didn't quit at year 11. but there's many times when I felt very discouraged that I should quit.
Well, what you've done, there's one style of documentary filmmaking, which is go interview all the experts, cut it together, put some fun music behind it and some graphics, and then you can cover a subject matter that way. And there's an intimidation factor for us lay folks to actually think about what all these experts are saying to us. And what you've done is you've been dogged enough not to just accept the first or second or third explanation that you've heard. So you've listened to those explanations, and then you've listened to some other explanations, and then you've asked some questions. And along the way, in your first film, The Exodus, I really feel like you were the probing instrument to reveal, if not discover, this amazing city of Avaris. Is that how you say it? Avaris? Avaris, which is underneath Ramses, and voila, there's evidence of the Hebrews, and then you pushed it even farther, and you found what's been a long time question in my mind was, when was the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph? When was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? What was the period? And even through all the work that I've done up and down the Nile Valley, I never had an adequate answer to that. So once you kind of cracked that nut, okay, there was a time frame where it fits, there was evidence of a people. All right, now that was a great film. If you haven't seen The Exodus, you should see it, Patterns of Evidence. You moved on, and now you dealt with the linguistic story. And is there, people say, well, Moses couldn't write the Pentateuch because his own obituary is in there. So how do you answer that question at the end of Deuteronomy? Moses writes his own obituary. Or that's like one of those easy discreditors, right?
Yeah. Yes. And what different scholars, and I filmed them actually giving those answers. And the approach that we've taken, once again, is I did know this in the beginning, but that it was okay to hear from multiple viewpoints. Oftentimes documentaries are actually mono viewpoint. They only have one viewpoint. What I've learned
called propaganda.
They really are. They're propaganda films, and they're both propagandas. And a lot of people that like that, they just like to hear what they believe reaffirmed. There isn't really a dialogue there. And so the danger when you do a film that has multiple viewpoints is that maybe if you come in it with a different viewpoint, that you might be challenged in your viewpoint. And so what you're trying to do, though, is to look for truth. And if you get to the end of the investigation and you go, you know what, I think I actually believe more wholeheartedly that this is true, and I'm more confirmed in my faith. That's what happened to me. I could see that when I went to, let's say, an expert, you brought up something really important, is that often you'll get an answer from an expert that is shallow, but it's about as deep as most people want to go. And then you ask the second question, and then by the time you get to the third question, they've never been asked those questions before. And I've actually had some scholars say, well, I don't know. You'll just have to ask someone else. And because what you're trying to get to is well, what is the truth about this? What do we really know about these things? Is it true? Or is it not true? Or why do you believe this? Why are you telling me that there's no evidence for Moses or the Israelites? And then you start to realize, if you spend enough time at it, that they have assumptions that they were given. And that's where we get into the paradigms, right? That there are ideas or things that are passed on from student to teacher. I'm sorry. Some of those are happening. There are ideas that are passed on from a teacher to a student,
right?
And that's just the way. That's where you are somewhat passing. That's how you pass through the system. And if the system says there is no evidence for the Exodus in the Bible, and if you believe that, you're going to have a hard time getting through the system and getting your degree. I've got that on tape. There are a lot of people who said, we see evidence for the Bible, but we can't talk about it, because if we did, we would be in trouble. We might be in jeopardy of losing our jobs. So once you start to get to that point, you start to realize something is going on here. And because people are telling a lot of young people, let's say scholars, and they're writing books in that the Bible is not historically true. And so they're walking away from their faith because they're believing what the professor is saying. And what I'm showing in these films is that if I go after those interviews and try to understand why they say this is not true, I find out that the answers aren't as strong as I was led to believe.
That's absolutely true, and it takes a little bit of courage and a little bit of working outside the system to do what you do. You probably couldn't have written or published these things if your salary was being supported by this or that university or seminary. You might not have been able to get any of these done if you were trying to produce for Netflix or Amazon Prime. So what you've had to do, and what I applaud you for, is you've had to just sort of do this work, take this pursuit, take these risks, and then release these films yourself through national events like Fathom, built your own bookstore, sold your own product. And there's a story here about entrepreneurship. There's a story here about filmmaking. But in my short time, I want to stick with what you've discovered about the Bible, because that's what's so interesting to me, is that this work hasn't just been so that you can sell a book or a film. It's been to truly pursue the truth of the Word. And it's so important to me to know whether or not I can trust it. So when the Bible says, Joseph brought his brothers into Egypt, and they were settled in Goshen, and they multiplied like crazy, and they became so numerous that Pharaoh down the road said these people would turn against us. If there's ever a war, they're going to side with the other side, so let's enslave them. And so they're enslaved. And then the story that the Israelites and the Hebrews said to tell for all generations is how God creates a people, and he pulls them out. And so your third and fourth film, called The Red Sea Miracle Part 1 and Part 2, really bring us to like the 14th chapter, I guess, of Exodus, where this amazing story takes place. Now, maybe you've heard the story, and I can tell the story, but I want to hear you tell the story. So give me the Sunday school story about what happens to these people as they, after the plagues are over, off they go. What's the story?
Well, like you said, it's in the 14th chapter, I believe, that it's only a number of verses that you're given, that basically the Israelites are after the Passover, where the angel of death comes through the land, and those that didn't have the blood of the lamb on their doorposts, the firstborn was killed of every person, of every family, and even of the animals. And so the Israelites then make haste to get out of Egypt, and they leave actually with gifts, because the Egyptians wanted them gone. They gave them gifts of gold and jewelry, and so they leave, and there's a set of direction. There's a direction that they were heading, and so in our films we create a list of things to look for.
And just let me say, when they leave, and then you deal with this in your film, the Bible says 600,000 men. So we're looking at a 1.5 million to 2 million people. You deal with some people who disagree with those numbers, but just for the sake of this discussion, we're talking about not like some families going out camping. We're talking about potentially a couple of million people on a massive sojourn. So that's a perspective to keep in your head.
Right, and that's one of the things that we looked at. In fact, we realized that there's a departure point and there was a destination point. And in between there's a direction, a desert, a detour to a dead end, and a deep sea. And so as we're looking at that, as we look at those different areas, obviously I uncovered questions. And one of them, like we said, had to do with, well, how many people left? And when we were talking about this, it was like, well, do we want to get into all that? And this film is called The Red Sea Miracle for a purpose, because it would be a miracle if that many people left and actually went out into the desert. Because you've been out in the desert, and you know how dangerous it can be, and how there is nothing. They call it a desert or a wilderness for a reason, because there's just nothing there to sustain people. There's no water, there's no food, it's hot, it could be very long distance to get back to where you could get to safety. And that's why when the Israelites, said, why did you bring us out in the wilderness to die? Were there no graves in Egypt? So this film looked at...
And just let me just stop you a second. If you haven't been there, like if you're listening to this podcast, and like me, I used to think that he brought them in the desert. In my mind's eye, I pictured the Sahara Desert, lots of sand dunes and walking. That's not at all what the Sinai Desert is like, is it? So the Sinai, just imagine it's 1 million people. It's a very hard-packed, rocky, mountainous. It's not a sandy desert, right?
No, it's not. There might be a few places where there's a little bit of sand, but most of the time it's almost like hard-packed. It's hard to describe, but almost like it's like pavement.
Yeah.
I mean, parts
Rocky.
of it yeah.
The mountains are brown and harsh. There's scarce foliage, and it's more like, I grew up in Arizona. It's more like that hot Arizona desert with mountains. It's not a sand dune desert.
Yeah, where you're kind of slipping and walking through deep bodies of sand or whatever, where every footstep is like dropping you into 4 or 5 inches of sand. No, it's not like that.
No.
In fact, the thing is that the geography hasn't changed a whole lot. It might be that it might have had a different climate, but back in the day, this was the way you got between Africa and what we call through Israel and up into Europe and all that. I mean, this was a passing area, a very narrow stretch where you could go through this area. So there was roads, and the Israelites were told not to go the way of the Philistines, which would have been a closer, an easier route to take. But they were told to go to the way of the wilderness of Yam Suf. And the Yam Suf, that's the big investigative question. Well, what was the sea that was crossed? So we realized...
Yam Suf meaning what we would translate as Red Sea, right? Yam Suf.
Yes.
Red Sea. Go the way of the Red Sea, yeah.
And Yam Suf, Yam means sea in Hebrew. And Suf, the question is, what does that mean? And we explore that in both of the films that we have. But that many people thought that the sea that was crossed was the Gulf of Suez, the left arm of the Gulf of Suez. The Gulf of Suez would be part of the left arm of the Red Sea. And I actually have a map here. I don't know if it would do any good to show you, but the point being...
Sure, show me. Can you hold it up?
Well, it's an ancient map.
Yeah, no, we can see it. Yeah, that's super helpful. Lift it up a little higher. Lift it up a little higher. There you go. You see the Red Sea there on the left, and you see the Gulf of Aqaba going up on the right.
Yep.
And at the top of the Red Sea, you see these little lakes and these little deltas. That's okay.
Yeah. They're up in that area.
And then now you're up into Timnah. Yep.
So a lot of people, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong side.
Yeah.
You got to see where I am.
Yeah.
So this is the Nile here.
There's the Nile. Yep.
I'm on the wrong side of the map. But
That's
anyway,
right. We can see it.
a lot of people think that this might be the area, and through here.
Yep.
They went. Yes, right up in this area, right through here.
Yep.
And so the question then did the crossing events happen near Egypt, or did they happen further away at the Gulf of Aqaba?
Yeah, right.
And some people thought originally that they crossed right through here.
Right.
And then over time, as we show in the film, as naturalism came and people started to question, could really the water part? They started moving up into these lakes area here. And as Egyptology started to grow, I called this a near Egypt, or the Egyptian point of view. But then other people are saying, well, no, King Solomon referenced Yam Suf, and others referenced Yam Suf, and Moses gave a geographical boundary of the land of Israel to be from this sea all the way up to here. So there's this debate then, this division between, is this Gulf of Aqaba the sea that was crossed, or is this area up here?
No, I think you did a fantastic job, Tim. And I just watched both of these films yesterday. I know that the second one hasn't been released yet. Thank you for sending me the rough cut. And I won't be giving away spoilers, or at least I don't mean to. But I really hope that if people are listening to our podcast today, that they take the time to watch these films. And here's these kind of controversies. What typically might happen, and I think you've done a nice job labeling one kind of the Egyptian perspective and one the Hebrew perspective, and you give both equal time. And I encourage people to read the text for themselves, read the Bible for themselves, watch your film. And one side of the equation tends to say, hey, God, if there is a God, if this happened at all, and if it did, then God worked through natural causes. And so that is an interesting thing. I read Bruce Feiler's books, you probably did years ago too, Walking the Bible, where he discovers, well, it could have been this, it could have been the manna, and it could have been this, natural causes, and there's some interesting stories there. The other side says when God works a miracle, that's when he goes outside of the natural causes. That's why it's called supernatural. Yeah. And so you take these two approaches. As a person who wants to know, is the Bible true or not, this can become a fundamentally interesting question, and you've got to be so careful not to just jump to the conclusion that you want to find, and under every rock you find an artifact, and in every cloud you get an answer. And yet at the same time, the Bible says that these Israelites, these Hebrews, when the strong east wind blew and they crossed through the Red Sea, whether it was the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds or the Sea of the Ending or whatever, that there were walls of water on each side. And it says that twice that description is used. So you actually remembered as a kid watching one of our predecessors, Cecil B. DeMille, working with the technology in the 1930s and then again in the 1950s. And when you talk about paradigms, that's not a Bible paradigm that we have. It's a memory of a filmmaker, but you went right and you showed how Cecil B. DeMille depicted the miracle, and then you sort of gave us a chance to say, where could the Red Sea crossing have happened? Is it up in those small little lakes, like you said, up at the north, the Sea of Reeds, or somewhere else? So you've you've sort of shown us your own paradigm. You said, hey, I was really influenced by Cecil B. DeMille. That's kind of what I wanted to find. You kind of admitted that. That was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually appreciate Cecil B. DeMille because I don't believe we would be having this conversation had he not made the Ten Commandments, because he kept the memory of the Old Testament alive in many people's mind, because every year it was a big network kind of Sunday night release, and as a kid I remember, hey, tonight the Ten Commandments was on, and it was one of those opportunities too to stay up past your bedtime, to be able to watch it. But it was a very impacting film, and what we see is that Cecil B. DeMille had two ideas. He portrayed the sea crossing in a Hebrew understanding because he couldn't get around the fact that the Bible says that the Israelites walked between walls of water. That's what he showed. That's the miraculous part about it. But he also then pushed it up closer to one of the seas up there near Egypt. So he had a hybrid. He portrayed it as a Hebrew, as I would call the Hebrew approach, more following the descriptions of what was being communicated in the text. And once again, there's a theme in these films, which is the role of the eyewitness account. Many miracles are eyewitness accounts that have been recorded throughout the scriptures. And the Red Sea crossing, and these are an eyewitness from Moses. Was Moses an accurate person to give an eyewitness account? Well, then I went back. Did he have a writing system to record it in a way? Did he have testimony that would support this? But the issue then goes back to with these miracles. The whole journey is filled with a supernatural understanding that things happened that were not natural to the Israelites, that God was revealing himself in a consistent way, whether it was the numbers of people that he sustained in the wilderness, the pillar of fire at night, the cloud by day that kept them shaded, the parting of the sea, his presence at Mount Sinai. All these things were supernatural. And for me, John, when I go through these films, I think it goes the same for any filmmaker. You get changed as you're making a film. And you have to ask these big questions because you're a writer and I'm a writer, and I have Steve Law who helps me as well. He's my writing partner. I realized that my faith was more naturalistic in some ways. Do I believe that God does miracles? Well, oftentimes, if something's wrong, let's say in my health, it's easier just to go to the doctor because it's a naturalistic approach to my life. But do I ever pray to be healed of something? And I didn't. I would just call the doctor. And, as we won't say anything that happens in the films, but we raise the question of miracles. And,
absolutely.
And as you know, in other parts of the world, there aren't any doctors to call. And people are faced with situations where the only thing they can do is call out to God, just like the Israelites, right?
Well, you ask one of your scholars, and by the way, Tim travels all over the world. I mean, he is in Cambridge and in Jerusalem and in Washington and in Tennessee and in Egypt. I lost count of how many people you talked to, but this is a globetrotter. But you ask one of the scholars, do you believe in such things as miracles? And she said, do you mean spectacular supernatural? Like you said, do you believe in the supernatural? Said, well, do you mean spectacular? Like there's like, well, I would believe in small miracles that could conceivably be called coincidences, but maybe not because the timing. Or are you talking about stuff like the Red Sea parting in walls of water? Because that's what would be a spectacular. There's no natural way that a wind, and the Bible does say God made a strong wind come from the east. If you had a shallow lake 2 or 3 feet deep, or maybe even 2 or 3 meters deep, you could conceivably blow the wind so hard as to reveal the sandbar. So maybe that's how God did it.
Right.
If you had a wall of water from a sea that could be 200 or 300 meters deep, and the walls standing up on each side, there's no wind, no natural explanation for that. So if you're asking scientists to confirm that, they can't really do that because science can't explain that in any way, right?
Well, the walls of water are something that would be so difficult. It doesn't happen, but you can get what we call wind set down. And wind set down is what we actually have an oceanographer that shows us, Carl Drews. And he wrote a book about this. And as he built a model, and we demonstrate that in the second film, the model, and how it would work. And so that if wind blows, it has to be about 65 mile an hour wind. And if you think about it, I don't know if you've ever been out in a 65 mile an hour wind, but if you're not too heavy, you could get blown away.
Mm.
You got to really press against that wind, and they'd have to walk kilometers. So there is a problem with a wind set down that has to do with the volume of wind that would press against someone. I didn't get into that deeply with the fact that you're pressing against the wind. So. But what I wanted to try to do in the film was to basically show, well, is it plausible? Is it plausible? I mean, that God worked in the wind, because if it was the causation of the water parting, the wind, or was it God acting and the wind was symbolic?
Right.
That's the big question.
Well, yeah, that is interesting. If the wind was blowing hard enough to split the ocean, then you couldn't have walked into it. If you take your Bible and you read Exodus, for one thing, it's a fun book to read, isn't it? It's stories. There's a few genealogies, but it's stories that you may have heard, but you maybe haven't really read for yourself. Maybe you have studied them, but if you're listening to the podcast today and you're listening to Tim, I think a great thing to do would be, if you've got your Bible, go reread the 14th chapter of Exodus. Read it first. Just read it. Let the Bible speak to you. And then take on these films that Thinking Man is doing, these patterns of evidence films, because you give us perspectives that we hadn't thought of. And one of the ones that I really appreciated, Tim, was you reminded me that this whole journey starts with Moses in Midian. He spends 40 years in Midian. God speaks to him through the burning bush at Horeb, or we call Mount Sinai, or what we call the mountain of God. And the confirmation that it's God is God says, when you return to this mountain to worship, then you'll know. So when Moses leads these people away from Pharaoh, you call it the destination, he is returning to Midian. He is returning to Horeb. There's probably 36 theories out there of where Mount Sinai is. There's probably 3 that I think are the preeminent ones. One is up in southern Israel near Timnah. There's a very credible source there. One is in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. That's kind of where I've spent some time, where I got, this is my studio. You brought a map, I brought a rock. So this is a rock that I took down from Jebel Katarina, which is in the southern Sinai. And I liked how this rock was tinged with black. And I just took that as a reminder that the mountain was on fire. And you can see that the surface is black, but the interior of the rock is not. But that's the theory of the mountain, which is kind of what we call the traditional place, where the Mount Sinai and then next to it, Jebel Katarina. But the third interesting place, the hardest one for any of us to visit, is the one that is in modern-day Saudi Arabia. And that's the one that would be visited if you crossed through the modern-day Gulf of Aqaba or went above it. And you remind us that is the land of Midian. So tell me about that.
Yes, correct. I might as well just grab this map and see if I can pull it up again. So what you're talking about is that, are you talking about Har Karkum as one of the mountains over here?
Well, yes, that's the one I say near Timnah, yes.
Yeah. And then there's the traditional Mount Sinai, which is
Right.
in this
That's
area
where my
over
rock
here.
is from. That's this one.
And then there's other ideas over here in Arabia.
Right.
This is the ancient Arabia, and the land of Midian is through here. And so we're looking at, in the future, as we move forward now, the next film is Journey to Mount Sinai.
Oh, good.
And so once we cross, then we're going to be looking at all the different crossing, all the different mountains where they could be. And so what will happen is that the question then is, if Moses was in Midian, the Bible says he was, that where does Midian, and was the mountain in Midian? You know, did Moses leave the land of Midian and go somewhere else to look for, to experience the mountain, or was he in Midian? But, so there's that whole debate is coming, of which we've been filming as well for a number of years. And so so I think that the film has its structure of which is a departure point. Well, I should do over here, a departure point and a destination. And in between there is a deep sea. Now, some people say, well, it's unfair to say it's a deep sea, but what I've tried to show in the film is that the scriptures call it a deep sea. And so, and it had a D in it. And I needed the D in order to work with all my D's, right?
Well, there you go.
But I could see that it was a deep sea throughout the scriptures, and even in the Song of the Sea, it talks about the mighty depths, which is Moses after the Egyptians are destroyed. There's this song that comes up, and you can look up for it there. So what
that's in 15, yeah.
Yeah, and it says that they sunk into the mighty depths. Well, the challenge that I had and that I was raising is that if the Israelites are in 3 feet of water, or if they cross 3 feet to 6 feet or 12 feet, it doesn't sound like the mighty depths, or was it just poetic? And so all I'm trying to do is ask the question, and I'll be honest with you, I'm okay if wherever it was, I just want to know, do we have it correct? Because it does impact how you think about things going forward. The issue then for me was the population. The biggest problem that I had making this film was, could there have been 2 million Israelites or more, 3 million Israelites in the desert? Because how in the world would you sustain them? That would be a miracle to sustain them. And what ends up happening is that there are a number of Christian conservative archaeologists in that can't believe that there could be that many people. And there's good questions that they're raising. But the Bible seems to be telling us that this word Aleph, which means thousand, which we'll get into in these films, doesn't mean thousand, or doesn't mean clan, or doesn't mean group, but there's some things that don't add up if you believe that they're just a clan or a small group. So there are people on the Egyptian side that are pushing this idea that when the Israelites left Egypt, there was only maybe 15 or 20,000 people. Then the question is, well, why were the Egyptians afraid of them? Because that doesn't seem like really that big of a population. If it depends on how many Egyptians there were, back in that day. So anyway, that's the investigation. As we've been looking at it, we've been breaking down all those big questions.
And you also, so here's another thing that you've done for us is maybe some of us have sort of peripherally been following this story, peripherally, maybe not, but it's a fantastically interesting story. And if you have time, like I said, you probably interview 20 scholars and you show all of their books, read all their books, but we don't have time to read all their books. Tim, you have to do that for us, and you have to go talk to them for us. And I was really, and I don't want to give away any of the movie, but we all kind of were wondering is there's smoking gun evidence. And one of your scholars who was of the Egyptian persuasion more than actually says, you show me one chariot wheel and I'll believe it. Now, I remember hearing rumors of chariot wheels being discovered years ago and of pillars being found on the sides of the Gulf of Aqaba. And it was sounded almost too good to be true. And one part of me wanted to shout it to the rooftops, say, hey, everybody, look, the Bible's true. We've now have proof. And another part of me urged caution. And I don't think I shouted it at all, and I think I just forgot about it. But I really appreciate the fact that you have gone back and taken a look at some of these claims. What can you say about that?
Right. That's what got me interested in the very beginning. I started this project because people said that there were chariot wheels being found on the bottom of the Red Sea.
Which would be significant.
Yeah, encrusted in coral. And so when I learned about that, I actually heard about that when I was at ICVM. This is over 20 years ago. And I actually decided to try to help distribute that film that was made about that. That was my inspiration for this. But that led me into then getting to this place where I couldn't let it go, or it wouldn't let me go. Mm-hmm. And a number of people. And it felt like there's more to be told here. And the thing that's important, I think, John, I'll just take a moment and give a bigger idea, is that God chose the people of Israel to reveal himself to them, that in the future they would reveal who he was to the world. And if we think about all the books that have been compiled that make up the Bible, it's all Jewish people. Because of Abraham, because Abraham followed God and went on a journey that he didn't know where he was going. He was given this, I guess, honor and privilege that his descendants would become these people that would become a light to the world. And then through them, through his seed, all nations would be blessed. And what we have is this book called the Bible, which, as I've looked at it, is really telling us that God has already knows what the story is. And our opportunity when we read the Bible is to see, are we going to believe it and are we going to join into God's story? Because either way, he's in control. And but he's told us the beginning, Genesis to Revelation. And what I'm doing with this investigation is when I heard about it and that there are chariot wheels, there was a place, and I don't know if it's chapter 14 or which says, I will gain glory over Pharaoh and his army, And I think it says that 3 times in Exodus. And my business partner, David Wester, when he read that, that was what kind of caused him to want to go forward with this. He felt that was something that was confirming for him. And I put that verse up in one of the climactic scenes. And I put that in the open of the second film. Because God has been gaining glory over the testimony of the world's most powerful nation at that time, that said, who is this God that I should worship him? Pharaoh said that about God. We have today people that say, who is this God that I should worship him? They don't know him. And over time, the symbolicness of the Exodus, it actually is going to repeat itself. The plagues of Egypt are coming in the last days. And people will say, who is this God that I should worship him? And they'll harden their hearts against God. And so could it be that understanding what happened in the past will help some people to realize that in the end, I believe in the book of Revelation, actually it says that the beast or the Antichrist, I'm not sure what character it is, but it is cast into the sea, the dragon, the serpent, the thing that represents the devil is cast into the sea, just as, and these come from all the interviews. I mean, I'm listening to these different scholars. They're saying there's a connection here between Exodus and the book of Revelations, and that these things are getting closer and closer in time, we believe. And if you understand what's happening, there's a poetry and a unity to what's happening.
Well, it's faith and hope and love. And with faith, we have hope, because the hope that God is big enough and real enough and interactive enough And then if there's faith and there's hope, then we're supposed to never lose the love. And in the last days, it's those who can endure and not let their love be completely drawn out of them, that those are the elect and the ones who will be called champions. It's a great work, Tim. How can we see your films?
Well, one thing I didn't answer for you was the question of chariot wheels.
Yeah.
So what we did is we ended up going back. I had been trying to film. I had hired diving teams throughout the years to go search for chariot wheels because I had heard about people actually seeing them. And so in this film, we do have in the Red Sea Part 2, the divers and the people that have been out searching and what they found, and skeletal remains. And some of this we could go in depth. Will probably be more in the box sets. But this was a huge controversial element of making this film because people were afraid that what I would be doing would be possibly trying to say that evidence was here that was more than it could be verified. And so what I tried to do is to show what we know so far, show the history of it, even including Ron Wyatt, who led people to the location where people are diving for the chariot wheels and the body parts and whatever they could find. And so that is going to be answered in this film. And I also have the critics, that they're saying, well, like you said, you show me a chariot wheel and I'll be convinced. And this tension back and forth that's going on. And so that is all going to be coming up into this Red Sea Part 2 film as well. And so there's also some surprises there that we have, and the fact that there's some very strong testimony of what has been seen. And and once again, the theme of eyewitness testimony is something that works its way through these films. The debate isn't over. It needs to continue. The investigations need to continue. For other people to come with maybe submarines and look deeper, because there's huge caverns in the Gulf of Aqaba. Mm-hmm. Now, if it happened in another location, then if the army was destroyed there, well, maybe they need to go and look with metal detectors and see if they can find brass or any kind of remains of Pharaoh's army in the other locations. That would be another part of the investigation to do. So you asked the question, well, how can we see this film? And we have a thinkers only release that's coming up here. And thinkers are part of our Thinking Man Films followers. And that's happening on July 17th as a exclusive online live event.
Really?
Which we'll have, yeah.
Wow.
And we're going to actually, before that, July 10th, we're going to have a showing as well for the first film if people haven't seen it, but that's a thinkers only, and you can become a thinker by signing up. But then we're going to go nationwide with Salem Radio Network. They've got a platform that we're working with, and that's going to go nationwide with Salem Radio Network on July 24th.
So, not theaters.
Not theaters. Yep. We decided that at this time it was going to be just too difficult for us to do all the advertising, have the kind of response that we needed, and to be honest, we just needed to basically release the film as a live digital release. Mm-hmm.
Well, again, this is Tim Mahoney, and he is the writer and the producer and the director and the star of the films, The Exodus, The Moses Controversy, The Red Sea Miracle Part 1, The Red Sea Miracle Part 2. And, you get your families, your wife is in this, your parents are in this, your grandkids are in this. This really is a personal journey that you've invited us along, and you kind of give us a little glimpse at your family through these processes. And I also just want to say in closing that, you're not going to get a chance to do this without taking some slings and some arrows. And I respect you immensely for the humble, sincere way that you carry yourself, that every time I've ever been with you, that you represent the highest forms of integrity, because I know that the critics will be vicious and have probably already been vicious and sarcastic and every other thing. And you got to have that armor of God on, my friend.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that one of the things is that, our films are longer films. I have to say one thing. I don't make these films alone. I've got a great team of, Steve Law helps me with research and writing, and Chad Green is our editor. And there's a whole bunch of other people that have helped me. And but the thing that I've done, they're longer films because they're multi-viewpoints. And so, oftentimes there isn't a lot. I have had as much pushback because actually the critics have got their say in it. Anybody and I'm open, to be quite honest with you, I'm quite open to, if they can persuade me that this didn't happen, I'm going to listen to it. Mm-hmm. But so far, I've not been convinced. Mm-hmm. I said, and I've actually had, in our other film, we had 3 men who grew up in Christian homes. Their fathers were pastors, or they were involved in spiritual activity, and they walked away from their faith. They became agnostics. And I said, well, what will that happen to me? But what I can tell you is that instead of walking away, my faith actually became strengthened. And I think the issue is that these films are risky films. I'm making films that are asking, the stakes are high. But the truth of the matter is that if you start to realize why people don't believe, sometimes it doesn't have to do with evidence at all. I think it has to do with other issues, because we all have free will, and maybe we want to do things we want to do, and we don't necessarily want to submit to the Bible or to the teachings of the Bible. But what's interesting, I've got themes, John, that I can see that are coming. And I know they're coming, that are going to be coming in these films, because God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And these themes of justice, justice is coming, by the way. Mm-hmm. God's justice is coming. It says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." God's kingdom is coming. And so there are things throughout history that keep repeating themselves. They repeat, they happen back in the days of the Bible, and they've been echoing through. But it's because there's this battle between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of this earth. And so anyway, all that to say is that we're experiencing some of that. And as time moves on here, as you know, I want the films to be contemporary, just because I think that the questions that we have are the same questions that they had back then.
Yeah, well, and that's why it's a personal journey, and you bring us into the very most you bring us even to Minneapolis. You live in Minneapolis. You are in the epicenter of what's been dominating our world and our newscasts, all through the month of May and June. And you are not immune from the realities of our world at all. I even talked to you, and I know you're within just a few miles of the epicenter. So these aren't just history lessons for the sake of studying history. You are really pursuing God and the truth. And I appreciate it. My journey, as yours has been the same, and the privilege that I've had to study biblical archaeology and see the two sides of the story has done the opposite from leading me away. I still have to work on obedience and holiness, but the Bible is just flat out true. And the more I've learned about it, the truer it has become. And now it's my job to learn to submit to it. Your journey has led you to some similar places, which is one of the reasons I encourage you. And I pray that you keep doing what you're doing, and that you don't go broke doing it, that somehow you can pay the bills, because there's no society out there that's paying for us to do exploration of the floor of the Sea of Aqaba. There's no profit to be made in proving the Bible. And in fact, there's an awful lot of people with high incentives to do the opposite. You are kind of a rolling stone rolling against the grain, Tim. And you are a brother, and I thank you, and I appreciate you. And I encourage everybody, if you're listening to the podcast, really, go check out the website and patternsofevidence.com, right?
That's correct, yeah.
So go to patternsofevidence.com. You can watch these films. All this is available. This is just a teaser. It's a fascinating, fascinating pursuit, and you're the only one I know doing what you're doing. So God bless you. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you, John.
Have no shame, no, we are not afraid, no shame of the gospel of his name. It's the power of God by which we all are saved. We need not be afraid.
No Shame is a weekly podcast where John Grooters discusses life at the intersection of faith and culture with all kinds of interesting and inspiring guests. Subscribe to the podcast today by going to johngrooters.com, select the podcast tab, and hit subscribe. Don't miss any of these life-giving conversations.